Hi everyone. I think we've still got people coming through, but if we get started, we've got a great topic today to talk to you all about. I'm Paula Kemp. I am at the Social Mobility Commission, Head of Employer Engagement. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Let's Talk About Class, or How to Talk About Class session today. A few housekeeping points. You'll notice that the chat function is not enabled, but if you do have any questions or want to contact the organisers, you can get through to the organisers. And if you have any questions for our panel, I'll be inviting you to pose questions to our panel as we progress with the conversation. Please use the Q&A function. The webinar will be recorded and we will be sending out the very brief slide deck, which has got some more resources for you, which we'll share later after the event. So we're here to discuss the importance of talking about class in the workplace. And we want to explore what a healthy and inclusive conversation about class looks like and how everyone can get involved. And so today I'm delighted to be joined by a couple of people we've worked with over the last year who are doing some great things in their organisation. And can really help support you with some ideas on how you might get started and what that healthy and inclusive conversation looks like. So we've first of all got Tim Smith. He's a partner based in London in Brian Cave Leighton Paisner, BCLP. They are a global law firm with about 1,400 lawyers across 31 offices in Europe, Asia, the Middle East and North America. Tim was firm-wide graduate recruitment partner for 6 years and now co-heads the firm's social inclusivity and ethnicity group. He's a trustee of both the Bridge Group and the Aspiring Solicitors Foundation, and having chaired the advisory board for Prime, he was appointed as a full board member earlier this year. So welcome, Tim. And then we've also got James Hillhouse, who is the co-founder of Commercial Break. So Commercial Break's an organisation focused on increasing working class representation in the creative and marketing industries. And they work with companies to ensure they're properly set up for working class talent to thrive in them, and also for young working class creatives to help them access the careers their talent deserves. So both with a lot of experience in this space. So just as we get started, as this is a discussion talking about class in the workplace, we spoke ahead of time and I asked our panelists if they would be happy to share their own backgrounds. So I wonder, Tim, would you like to, and they obviously agreed, and Tim, I wonder if you'd like to share that.
Sure, thanks, Paula. Afternoon, everybody. Very happy to tell you a little bit about my background and my journey. I was born and bred in Northampton, where I attended local comprehensive schools, decided at a fairly early age that I wanted to pursue a career in law. And so I studied law at Nottingham University before then returning to Northampton and taking a training contract, or articles as it was in those days, with one of the local firms in Northampton. When I qualified, I moved to their office in Peterborough, where I spent a couple of years dealing with commercial property and planning matters before joining the firm that is now BCLP as a planning lawyer in 1996. And I've been there ever since. Those doing the maths, yes, that is 25 and a half years in the same organisation. But that's a little bit about my background and journey.
Brilliant, thanks, Tim. I wonder what you get for 25 years. Maybe we'll talk about that offline.
I'm still waiting to find out.
Oh, okay. And James, how about you?
Thanks, Paula. Hi, everyone. So I think probably up front, I should probably say I wouldn't consider myself to be working class. You know, my parents are. The rest of my family, including my siblings, are first in my family to go to university. But I'd say I was more a sort of kid of the suburbs, not the council estate. But, and I think this is sort of animated much of what the work I've done, you know, I was brought up to believe that working class was a badge of honour. You know, my parents come from that 60s baby boomer generation where it absolutely was that. And I just think culturally, a lot of the stuff that I sort of think and enjoy or feel or sometimes even, you know, struggle with come from the social mobility I've experienced. now, particularly now, I think, as I guess I'm living a kind of middle class life that, in all honesty, I'm slightly conflicted about. But yeah, that's me really.
Brilliant, and thanks for both being very honest. So from my perspective, my dad was a builder, and if you use the key parental question that we talk about in our resources in terms of finding out about your background, I would be considered working class. But like you, James, I think there's a bit where my parents decided that they wanted to buy their own house very early on and make that decision and moved into what is a suburb of London. So again, quite conflicted in those views. So kind of already we see a pattern here about how it's a very nuanced subject, really. So jumping straight in, Tim, I know BCLP have been involved at the very heart of understanding experiences of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds for many years, starting through research with the Bridge Group. So if you think back to when you first started talking about class in the workplace, what were the first steps you took to engage with employees?
Well, the first thing that we considered it important to do, Paula, was to collect some data to be able to establish what our baseline position was. And when I talk about data, I differentiate between quantitative data and qualitative data. And they serve two different purposes, really. Quantitative data tells you, if you like, the scale of the problem that you face, but it's qualitative data that gives you the richness of information about why you're facing particular challenges. So I sometimes like to use a medical analogy, which is that quantitative data is about diagnosis, but you need qualitative data to be able to help you with cure. And so we sent an employee survey to all of our colleagues, asking questions about gender, about race, about religion, disability, and social economic background. And we took that information to be able to establish what our baseline position was. And then over a period of time, we also engaged with colleagues just to get some of the qualitative data. What was their lived experience within the organization? For those who were trainees coming into the business, what was their perception about the culture of the firm and how did they differentiate between the different law firms that they were interested in? And equally importantly then, as I know is fairly common practice with lots of organizations, when you had people who were leaving the organization, to encourage them to give really honest feedback in an exit survey, including things like what they felt about the culture. Was that any part of their reason for looking to leave the organization? And from that, we've been able to build up a picture of the areas that we need to tackle, some of the challenges that we face, and then, as you say, we've been able to embark on some really quite interesting research, which has helped us with some techniques to be able to address some of the challenges that we discovered as part of that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. And James, with the companies that you work with, what sort of advice do you give them to sort of kick off that conversation?
Well, I think what Tim said is spot on. Really, I suppose the things I would add to that are make sure you're engaging with all departments, not just key departments. That can often get forgotten, and we often refer to sort of front of house and back of house. You've got to engage with all departments when you do this at a qualitative level, and also make sure you're engaging with all levels of seniority. Sometimes the temptation sometimes is to bypass the middle and the top because it feels like, well, we started this project off, and the middle because the middle has been there for a while and you don't want to know about it. But it's important to do all of that, really. And then the other thing I would add, something that we do a lot of is just observation, which can sound a little creepy in a way, in that we're sort of hanging in meetings and social functions and just seeing how people operate together. But certainly from a cultural perspective, that can be incredibly rich. And what we always do when we work is we always make sure that myself and my co-founder are involved, but also that we have a couple of young people with lived experience of what we're looking at to come and observe with us, because they're the insights that really can unlock change.
Brilliant. And so I guess that's how you would work with organisations to support that cultural shift. important to get leadership buy-in to drive that conversation. Would that be the case, James?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the reality is, without sounding cynical, without leadership buy-in, nothing happens, because they're the people, they're the top of the pyramid who make everything happen. And if I can draw a comparison, I don't know if any of you have been watching that series on BBC Two called Pilgrimage, in which modern day minor celebrities trace pilgrimages for former figures throughout history. And there's one at the moment about St. Columba, and he went over from Ireland to Scotland to bring Christianity. And what was the first thing he did? He went to all the leaders of the tribes. He didn't go to the lower echelons of the tribes. So, way back in time, we already know you've got to unlock the leaders to actually get change within it. And I think what's key when dealing with those leaders, I mean, I sort of alluded to it just before, is to make them realize that they're part of the process. They're not just people pushing the button on it. So we have to allow them and insist that they embrace everything that we'll be doing with the rest of their company, that they are fallible, that they own up to mistakes and own up to lack of knowledge, which sometimes leaders are uncomfortable doing because they're normally the people with all the answers. But also, really importantly, that those leaders are measured by how far the company gets upon the criteria that they alight on, and importantly, are held accountable for those key criteria. So some of the best places, actually, there's some great NBA teams who have done great things in diversity. And one of the key things that they do is leadership team. When you are judged at the end of the year, you will be evaluated on how far you go on this. So they have KPIs for the leadership team, and they are rewarded or not rewarded according to that. So I think leadership team is vital. But I think also when we work with places, we try and create a series of steps, both in terms of how they perceive individual progress within an agency and how we work with any companies for them to achieve that. So we kind of think of, certainly in creative fields, there's too much of a focus on finding working class talent and probably welcoming working class talent in a very enthusiastic way. But there is hardly any focus on making sure that talent feels like it belongs, and even less focus on making sure that talent thrives when it's in a company. And that's what our goal is in Commercial Break, is to ensure that any individual can thrive in any organization. And essentially, I think, so I'm slightly going off the leadership topic, I hope that's okay. But essentially, what that involves, I think, is companies looking at three things. And those three things are working practices, how you work. They are progress, so how people are promoted, how people are financially rewarded, grievance processes even, but looking at how people go throughout an organization, and culture. Yeah. And I think the thing that we found is particularly difficult, certainly in creative industries, where the culture is informal and open, is that it's really hard to pin down what culture is. And I think a lot of companies think we're nice people, we have an informal culture, we're supportive of everybody, but they can't see that culture has been created in their own image, and that not everybody might feel the same way about it. So when we work with companies, we use a 5-step process. It involves understanding, auditing, as Tim's mentioned, with the work that has to be done on kind of data gathering, working out a plan of change to ensure that we can actually affect the change that's needed in the organization, then kind of working out how we'll sustain it beyond kind of point zero, and then we work out how we can recruit. So what we do is almost insist that companies do all the hard work, set the stage for success, and then, and only then, think about getting people in. And I think it's just quickly worth saying, on the understanding side of it, because it's something we haven't talked about yet, I think that takes two forms. One is for companies to understand what they really want to achieve, with whom, and why they want to do it. And not enough of those conversations happen at leadership level, or it's kind of implied. And actually, when you get people in a room and ask them all individually, you often find that you get very, very different answers to the same thing. So to get them understanding what they want to do. And then probably the most crucial thing we do with any company is to expose them to lived experience. We've put together, and any company could do this, we surveyed everyone who's ever been through commercial break, loads of other projects with us, so that we can go in front of them with people who've had the lived experience, delivering the information and saying, this is what the experience is like, this is what it feels like, and this is what the experience overall is. And it's an incredibly powerful way for people to realize that maybe the company isn't set up as it needs to be. And then one last thing I would just say on the sort of change side of thing is get the momentum going is really important. So you will need big changes, but start off with small changes that you can affect almost this afternoon, because then you'll build up the momentum and it will stick. Because if it feels too hard to start with, it won't work.
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Thanks, James. And I guess that's the point about the open dialogue. So open dialogue at leadership level, at all levels as well. Tim, I just want to address, someone's asked in the Q&A, so I think actually we should maybe be defining what working class is. So how did you define in your survey?
Yeah, there's some very interesting questions being posed in the Q&A, Paula, which I've been discreetly monitoring out the corner of my eye. And they go to the same point, which is how do you define social background? How do you bracket it? And then what do you do in order to define what you're doing to serve different communities within your workplace? I think one of the difficulties, which is implied by one of the questions which has been asked, is if you're a global organization, then social background means different things to different people. And I know from having spoken with partners in the US that if you say to them social mobility, their immediate reaction is that's not really a thing in the US, but actually when you start drilling down into it and you're looking at the type of outreach that they're doing, they do sponsor people from inner city schools. They do outreach so that they can explain to people what a career in the law is like. And you say to them, well, that's social mobility outreach. You may not call it that, but it's social mobility outreach. But I think what that highlights is that when we're talking about all kinds of different diversity, it has different resonance in different parts of the world. If you look at ethnic diversity, for example, then there's a much higher concentration of Hispanic community in the US, not really a thing in the UK, and yet that would be something that they look to deal with and to level up to the majority population. In terms of the question, how we went about defining it, we didn't seek to define working class. What we sought to do was just get an impression from the data as to what people's socioeconomic background was. And I think that the definition of the criteria is a very good example of how we need constantly to be evolving our thinking on this. In some ways, social background is the new kid on the block in diversity. It hasn't been around for as long as some other diversity characteristics, but we're learning an awful lot more about it now. And when we began, we may have defined social mobility as being defined by two characteristics, really. State school or non-state school, and first generation to go to university. And that would be the be all and end all of the questions that you asked. There's some organizations that still confine their questions to those. But if you think about it, there's something in excess of 60% of the population for a period of years have gone into some form of higher education. So if you're defining by reference to first generation to go to university, it's going to be a decaying characteristic, which won't be telling you very much. A little plug then for Paula and the work of the Commission is you've got a very good toolkit which helps to explain what are the characteristics that have most impact on your ability to progress. And what's generally reckoned to be the most reliable one now is household income or parental income at the age of 14. Nobody knows what their parental income was. So as a proxy to that, you ask the question, well, what was the occupation of the lead income earner within your household at the age of 14? And so that's the question that we're beginning to ask now. But you have to be a bit careful about it, because the more reliable data can often appear to be the more intrusive type of questions to be asking. And certainly if you'd asked me what was our household income when I was 14, the honest answer is I haven't got a clue. But even if I did, I may not be prepared to tell you. And so you've got to be asking questions in a way which is going to elicit some type of response that will be valuable to you. So we didn't attempt to define working class, but we nevertheless got an impression of social mobility by asking an evolving series of questions, including things like parental occupation, spent any time in care, spent any time as an asylum seeker, eligibility for free school meals. Those all point to a particular social background, which helped us to build the picture.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think that's really what we need to focus on here. There are nuances to all of that. So it's parental occupation is the best question to ask, but we do know there can be flaws in that. You know, often we're asked about nurse and plumbers being in different classes because plumbers could, earn more than a nurse, etc. But there are, there's factors that show, and that's a different masterclass talking about data, so I'm not going to go into it now. But I mean, we know it's an emotive subject, really, don't we? So, and there's, issues in what terminologies to use, and so how do we think employers can address it and create sort of that safe space for employees to share their experiences? Tim, I might come back to you first on that, really.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, Paula, which is you've got to foster an environment in which people are comfortable being able to talk about background, about challenges, that they don't feel as though they're going to be accused of displaying overt or unconscious bias. It's almost a space in which it's okay to make mistakes, because in making mistakes you're better able to understand how things are working out. A shared license to say the wrong thing is a term that I've heard used, and often what we find, if you look at the research around culture, which I completely agree with James, is one of the key things, and it's no matter what level within an organization you are, culture is going to have an effect on you. But culture is a creation of, yes, overt behaviors that you see, but it's also of a series of micro behaviors which together may not seem like much and may very well be unconscious, but they all help to reinforce the sense of what the dominant culture of an organization is. And there's quite a lot of psychological research has been done on micro behaviors and how you tackle them, whether unconscious bias training really has the value that perhaps the industry has felt that it has done for a period of time. But I think fundamentally we've got to be prepared to be open about these things, and to be able to challenge ourselves with how our behaviours are being received by those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. That's the key to it.
Yeah, definitely. James?
Yeah, no, I listen, I really echo what Tim's saying there. And I think we found that still too often, I talked about working class being a badge of pride, but still too often it's seen as a badge of shame, something that, as Tim was saying before, that you have to mask. Even guys that we've worked with who've been through commercial break would still feel about that. I mean, I think Tim's right. Look, instigating a culture of openness to have those conversations is really important. And actually, to loop back to the conversation we were having about what's the best way to kind of figure out working class when we're doing surveys and stuff like that, I'd say a crucial step before you even do that is to explain to everybody in the company why you're doing it, what the benefits of it will be. Because as with anything, if people understand what the process is, they'll be more likely to get involved like that. And I think the other thing I would recommend on that, because I've seen there's a couple of questions about it, is getting the third party to do your data collection and allow them to own the data rather than the company owning the data, because then people will feel more comfortable sharing that. But I think the most important thing for me is that the people within your organization or who are already working class, make sure that they have a voice, make sure that they are listened to, that it doesn't just become middle class people telling working class people how they feel and what their experience is, which can happen in some places. And I think within that, terminology is really important. I would really heavily advocate the term working class, not even actually social mobility as the focus. One is a descriptor, working class is a descriptor, social mobility is actually the goal overall, and certainly avoid terms like deprived, underprivileged, etc., because that would just put people on the back foot immediately. And I think I'd also say that, recognize that when you're starting this, that this is very much just the first step on the journey, that this will be an ongoing process of learning and failing and progressing and establish that. And I think that will help people come to terms with the fact that they are allowed to make mistakes. But I'd also say that even if you're saying we're going to try and get this so that working class people can thrive more in our company, the changes that you will instigate will benefit everybody. And I think you need to set that up front as well, to say this isn't just about us kind of focusing, we will build a better company when anyone can thrive. But I would say my single maybe mindset shift that I would put into people's head is we've done a lot of work around neurodiversity as well, specifically around dyslexia. And dyslexia is always talked about as a superpower. And I think if you kind of think in terms of working class being a superpower, particularly within middle class companies, then you will be thinking along the right lines. I mean, certainly we do a lot of work with advertising and marketing. And to have that mindset is going to enable you to connect with the majority of the country in a way that other people can't. So I would really advocate that. It's a superpower. Think of it that way, and you won't go far wrong.
Yeah, so
I completely agree. Yeah, completely agree. And I think if I might just add, Paula, because I think this is a trap that people can sometimes fall into when we talk about culture and recognizing the diversity within your culture. What this should not be about is allowing working class people to better assimilate into the dominant middle class culture. That shouldn't be what it's about. It should be celebrating the difference, the superpower that comes from the difference. And I completely agree, James, that makes for a much better, stronger, more resilient organization if you're able to do it. But it's very easy to say that. It's much more difficult to put it into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks both. I think also there's some, having spoken to the Bridge Group before, they've said to us that, they've done some research and being asked about your socioeconomic background is not any more emotive than being asked about your religious or your sexual orientation background, religious background or sexual orientation. It's just that we're more used to being asked that. We've been asked it for since the Equality Act's been in place, and it's featured in all of the hiring and the ONS survey, the census, etc. So that's brilliant. I think we might have covered a bit of it, but is there anything else that people should absolutely avoid talking about when talking about class? Tim?
I think the answer is, it's a slightly glib answer. Yes, there are things that you shouldn't be talking about, but probably far fewer than you might think. You don't want to be displaying overt bias, obviously, but you still need to be able to create an environment in which people feel that they can comfortably talk about their background. They can comfortably talk about the obstacles that they perceive to advancement. And James mentioned earlier, this is not just about entry-level recruitment. This is also about how people migrate up through an organization and eventually attain senior management positions. And their perception of the barriers and obstacles that they face within an organization will differ depending on the level that they're at. And so there has to be a culture in which there are no recriminations from hearing what might be hard truths from people that say, look, I'm looking up at the senior management here and I can't see anybody there who looks like me. So how are you going to tell me that this is a realistic goal for me to strive for? And that's quite a difficult confrontational message to give, but it's essential to be able to have those kind of conversations, because you may actually find that because social background is a masked characteristic, you are surprised by the background of the people that you are looking up at. You don't recognize somebody who has a background which is actually quite similar to yours, but you nevertheless have to be fostering an environment in which those conversations can be had. Because if they're not, and everybody's just skirting around these difficult issues for fear of offending somebody, then we're not going to make the progress that we could be making.
Yeah, brilliant. And James, do you have anything more to add on that?
Yeah, I would just, I mean, it's a wider point really, but just be careful about how you talk within class, about class within diversity. And I think what the companies that get it wrong, they have a focus on diversity and everything kind of feels mushed together in a way. If you're going to do class properly, do class, don't make it feel like it's the fifth cab off the rank on your diversity push. But equally, and I noticed there was some comments on this in the Q&A, equally, make sure you're looking into the intersectionality within class, because it could be that the people you need to advance in your business wouldn't consider themselves working class because they have another dominant characteristic that they think is more defining of them. Now, that doesn't mean they have any less merit in going through your business and progressing through your business. But I think the biggest single tip that I could give is, yes, talk is important, but the biggest trap that people fall into is they just carry on talking and they don't do anything. You know, we always talk about the suffragettes and their motto of deeds, not words, because that's ultimately the proof of the pudding is in what you actually end up doing. So don't just get stuck in the cycle of chat.
Yeah. And I would also, on top of that, add, if you're a social mobility network within an organisation and you're doing some focus groups with people and finding out what those barriers are, come with solutions as well. That you think will work, because I think organisations would welcome the opportunity for people from all backgrounds to kind of say what they think will work to kind of help address inclusion within an organisation. You touched upon it a bit, Tim, already, about the sort of the progression through an organisation. But in terms of, obviously, a lot of people do in this space talk about early careers, apprenticeships, work experience, outreach, etc. But we do know there's been recent research and research done by the SMC as well, that in a lot of organisations, there's sort of that barrier as you progress through an organisation. But is there a necessity to talk differently about class as you progress through that employee life cycle?
I'm not sure that we're necessarily talking about it differently, but we're recognizing that the barriers and the obstacles are different, and therefore you need to approach them in a different way. Most of the work that's been done, and some great work within organizations across all sectors, has been done at the entry level. And it's a natural place to start because that's where you're more comfortable doing outreach. You've got established networks with higher education institutions and with recruiters. But the biggest myth in diversity, this applies no matter what type of diversity you're talking about, is the trickle up effect, that once you sort the pipeline, the rest will sort itself. And that never proves to be the case. It's not proven to be the case for gender, for ethnicity, for social background. You constantly have to nurture the process and make sure that at each different stage that you're looking at, your processes are fit for purpose. And so if I take as an example professional services firms and the progression to partner or senior director level, very often the characteristics and the skills that you value in order to have people promoted are things like the size of your network, your ability to present well, your ability to network effectively. And a lot of these things, I won't say are not found in people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but they take much longer to be able to bed down, and therefore they've had less time to be able to practice them. So what you're actually doing is you are prizing the characteristics which people from a more advantaged background have had longer to put into practice and therefore are more likely to be able to demonstrate effectiveness. And so if you can critically assess the criteria that you use for promotion to partner or director, and just be able to say, are we favouring any one particular group of our employees above the other? Then I think that's a very good example of how the interventions that you make later in somebody's career are different from the interventions that you make at the outset of their career. And there's beginning to be more research done on that. You mentioned the Bridge Group a couple of times, and also the fact that I'm involved in the Bridge Group, so I make no apologies for saying this, but the Bridge Group has done a couple of reports on the legal profession, and the most recent one that it did was looking at everything from 3 years post-qualification experience all the way up to partner. And unsurprisingly, it's showing that the statistics for management and partnership level are deeply unrepresentative of social background. But it also has begun to look at why those difficulties are present and the sort of interventions that can be put in place in order to assist people. And we talk about mentors very often and visible role models, and they are incredibly important at all levels. But within mentoring, you can maybe look at a pure mentor, somebody who will coach you on the development of your skills, the kind of things that you need to put into practice in order to make that leap to partnership. But you've also got, equally importantly, you've got sponsors, and they are people who are more outward facing. They are people who will say to you, I'm going to take you on this journey with me. I'm going to make sure that you are allocated the right kind of work that will resonate with the partner promotion committee who comes to look at your application. I'm going to be the one who bangs my fist on the table in partnership meetings saying, you've got to be talking about this person because I've seen firsthand the skills that they've got. And so there are things that can be done to assist people as they get to more senior levels and they're looking to make that final leap to director, partner, and management level, but they are different from the interventions you put in place earlier in their careers.
Brilliant, thanks, Tim. And James, in terms of in the creative industries, what sorts of things have you seen people doing and talking about to kind of support that progression piece within an organisation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's dissimilar to what Tim was talking about, really. I mean, a lot of the work we do is just to get people to make the paths of progression more obvious, clearer, and simpler, really. I mean, it really, a lot of the work we do really is just about getting people to put systems into place that everybody can understand. You know, there's that great book, isn't there, The Class Ceiling by Sam Friedman, that finds, you know, talks about the class pay gap that exists, and we see that again and again. The thing that Tim is talking about, you know, when you get to the moment where you might go up to the next level, perhaps you don't have the kind of like the game that other people might have to understand those rules. So it's very similar. It's probably not worth replicating a lot, but one thing that I think could be interesting, just as a phrase to have in mind, is we do some work with an organisation called the Data and Marketing Association, and they have a focus which they call From Classroom to Boardroom, which is basically every diversity thing they do is about that whole kind of journey. And I think if you have that in mind, that you're going right from school right up to, you know, managing director, chief exec level, then that's a kind of like just a good kind of mnemonic almost to get it right.
Brilliant. I love that, because we've been doing some work on in work progression, and especially in some of the lower pays, and there's lower paid industries, and there's that piece around kind of, you know, that learning step, but also developing a career path in an organisation and making it very clear, and comes fully back to open dialogue, open transparency, all the things that you would want to be able to feel comfortable talking about backgrounds and experience and everything that you want to bring to an organisation. We've got a few questions, so I'll come to those in a minute, but I'm just wondering, James, how important is it for employers to widen their conversations outside their workplace and to share it across industry? So obviously grateful for both of you to be sharing with our 200 and odd people on the call today from various backgrounds. But yeah, over to you, James.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's absolutely vital, because, you know, the majority of companies that we work with, They are good people wanting to do the right thing, either morally, but more importantly for their business. But most of the time, the thing we hear from them is we just don't know how to do it, and we don't know how to do it right. So there's just a lack of understanding. So any sharing is just really powerful, because it can be transformative, that, you know, across your workplace, with other people's workplace, or if you're in, you know, in the first steps yourself, you can actually know what you're meant to be doing. I mean, there's a couple of things that are quite interesting in the advertising industry. There's a company called Havas that created a thing called Press Pause, which was essentially about grievance processes. You know, grievance processes obviously can often be incredibly complicated, and feel as though the person who's had the wrong done to them is almost, you know, the suspect throughout this process. Puts a lot of pressure on that. But they came up with Press Pause, really simple 2-page guide to how to do it in any kind of awkward situation, any kind of explosive situation. And then they just shared that out with the industry as a whole, and it was taken on by other companies very successfully. Or there's another company called Creature London, who created something called In the Wild, which was an in-house training scheme for people from working class talent. And, you know, it worked incredibly well for them. And they're now open sourcing it to the rest of the industry, you know. And I would say it's hugely important, because that will give greater knowledge, will create kind of like greater opportunities. But also, if I was being really cynical, it's a great image enhancer for any company that actually does that. But I think within this, we also have to be quite careful, because when we get into those realms, we can think of things often as industry issues. This industry has an issue. And whilst that can be helpful, what it can also lead to is individual inaction. We often see companies who think, you know, almost throw their hands up and think, well, what can we do? It's an industry-wide problem. And the answer is, you are part. It's like almost like, oh God, there's terrible traffic today. Well, you are traffic. So you are within that industry. You should actually be doing it. So we mustn't make that mistake, really. But overall, companies just need to be open on this. You know, Paula, you were saying transparency before. They have to be transparent all round, not just to the industry themselves. You know, it's so important now from a recruitment perspective. Young people coming into certainly creative industries are expecting transparency about what you are doing, what you've done wrong, what you're going to do to put it right in the future. Clients expect this as well. For your image, for the perception that you have, it's really important to be open about what you're doing. But so that's almost, I guess, within the industry. But then also just more widely, we shouldn't just learn from other companies. We should learn from other industries as well. I mean, the legal profession is one that we've always learned a lot from, which always feels like it's kind of ahead of a lot of other industries. So it's always about having your radar up, I think, and being humble about what you do and don't know.
Yeah, brilliant. And Tim mentioned earlier, shameless plug for the SMC resources, but we've been really fortunate to have a lot of employers share with us their best practice. So you can visit, and I'll share the resources page in a bit, really. Tim, I think before we go on to last question I've got for you before I look at some more from the audience, what role do you think allies play in talking about class? We've talked about, obviously, in a lot of organisations, senior leadership team may not come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but therefore there are ally opportunities for them there. So what role do you think they play in making sure this is an open dialogue?
Well, I think firstly, there's got to be an understanding amongst senior management whether or not they share the diversity characteristics of the group that you're trying to support as to what the issues are that are being faced. And there's no substitute for authenticity here. You've got to have people who are genuinely committed to hearing about how the culture of an organization is being perceived. But equally, this is not just about the danger, as both James and I have spoken about, is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to assimilate everybody into what already exists as the dominant culture. And this is not about that. This is about celebrating difference. This is about recognizing the value that difference gives you. Any number of research, McKinsey, for example, will tell you that diverse teams perform better just because of the wealth of experience and diversity of experience that they bring to a particular topic. I can remember a a few years ago now, I got involved in a real estate presentation. It was Women in Property, where I was asked to interview a lady called Alison Nimmo. Alison Nimmo was part of the London 2012 Olympics Committee, and then went on to become Chief Executive of the Crown Estate. And I was asked to interview her in front of a room full predominantly of women, about 500, about her career journey. And a question that I'd agreed early on to ask Alison so that she could tell the audience her thoughts was, is there anybody who, as you've been working up through your career, you've particularly valued your interaction with? And she said, well, I'm going to name two. One of them is a woman and the other one is a man. And she paused and looked at her audience and said, yes, ladies, because we can't do it without their support. And so I think this two-way dialogue is critically important, that not only have you got people whose lived experience is telling them what the obstacles are, but people who haven't experienced those obstacles, hearing it for themselves and explaining, if they can, what their own journey has been like, and recognizing why they haven't had to experience the same obstacles that they're now hearing about from others. And I think in any diversity sphere that we talk about, having visible role models, it can't be underestimated, the value of it. And if I think back to some of the things that we've done around disability, for example, within BCLP, we had just a series of posters that were put up in all of the kitchens about people telling my disability story, whether that was neurodiversity that they had that people didn't necessarily know about, or caring responsibilities that they had for others. And the reaction to it was incredible, because there were so many people who would seek out these colleagues who'd been brave enough to tell their story and said, wow, I had no idea about that. Please tell me more. I want to learn more. Now, that wasn't an example specific to social background, but it's just people who are willing to put themselves out there and say, this is my story. It can only enhance the learning and the understanding that we have. We talk about, and maybe come on to this if we've got time at the end, to talk about presentation and accent and appearance. But I can well remember having a meeting with Nicholas Cheffings, who's the outgoing chief executive of Prime, the Solicitors Social Mobility Charity. And there were three of us in this meeting room. And at one point, Nicholas sat back and he said, you were a fly on the wall in this meeting room. You would form an impression of our likely social background by virtue of where we are, what we're saying, what we look like, what we sound like. And in all three cases, you would be completely wrong. And so when you have masked characteristics like social background, you have to have a medium through which you can say to people, this is my journey. This is how I dealt with some of the difficulties that I've experienced. Or maybe I didn't experience these same difficulties that you did, but it's that richness of lived experience that helps everybody to be able to identify with them, seek them out for guidance, but otherwise just to understand that the culture of the organization is partly shaped by these lived experiences as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. James, I'm going to come on and ask you that question as well, but I'm going to wrap into it a question that's come up in the Q&A, which is about accents, because Tim talked a bit at the beginning about accents. So does the panel think that thick regional accents impact on people's career? So James, if we could have your thoughts on some allies as well, because I know that you had some thoughts on there, but also about regional accents.
Sure. Let me, as Tim was just talking about allies, I'll just very quickly say a couple of things. So I think one is, there's that quote about it takes a village, isn't there? And I think everyone has a role to play, whether you're overt allies or not. And we think in terms of examples. So can you just, by the way that you act, whatever level you are, show that you are, conversant with what you should be doing. I think in terms of advocates, probably higher up the chain of command, which are people who can be saying, no, we need to do this, and kind of like always kind of like leading the charge. And then third level, probably higher up, is shapers, people who can actually instigate change. You can be any of those things. So at any level, you can create change. I think the big thing, allyship can often lead into mentorship, can't it? And I think the big thing that I would encourage everyone to do who's thinking of putting a mentor scheme into their company is train your mentors. It is not enough for your mentor to be an empathetic, nice person. It doesn't mean they know how to be a mentor. So make sure, invest up front in mentorship, and then make sure it is a commitment, not something that drifts in and out when they happen to have time. Then in terms of regional accents, I think it depends on the industry. I think probably the short answer is yes, it can do. I think what we found is that when regional accents stick out at work, so if everyone else is speaking RP, and then you have a regional accent within it, it can become a problem. But in the right organizations, it can be a problem up front and not going forward. So what companies need to do is they need to recruit people with a regional accent in numbers and then back them. I mean, that is the crucial thing. Get them in front of clients, get them into the right meetings, because they will prove their worth, and then the accent won't become an issue so much.
Brilliant, thanks. Tim, have you got any thoughts on accents?
Yeah, I agree with James. I think hearing a variety of different accents is always going to be valuable. And I talked earlier about micro behaviors, sometimes also called microaggressions, and some of the qualitative data that has been obtained in this area shows that an example of a microaggression would be to correct somebody's pronunciation of certain terms, which is pretty damn patronizing if you think about it.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that the way in which that is received is disproportionate to how the person who is doing that, maybe in a light-hearted way, so they think. It feels as though it's going to be received, but what you're saying when you correct somebody's pronunciation of certain terms is there is a norm and you don't conform to the norm, so I'm going to help you to conform to it by telling you how you should be pronouncing these words. So I think one has to be very careful with it. The presentation of advice in the legal sphere is important, but it's far less important than the content of it. And a regional accent conveying advice is conveying it just as effectively as other forms of more neutral accents. So I think we have to be very careful. And the more you draw attention to it, almost, the more you're subliminally telling somebody that you're an outlier here. You're not part of the dominant culture of the organization, and you need to conform, which is not what we should be doing at all.
Yeah, and I love that, Tim, in terms of, it's the content. So I, many years ago, taught English in Greece, and yes, whilst I was teaching kids grammar, etc., if they could communicate with me, that was the whole purpose. I needed to understand what they were saying. So regardless of what the grammar was like or their accent, if I understood what they said, I understood what they said. There was no issues there. So thanks for that. I think we got time for one more question that I've now lost, but it was around, have either of you got one quick tip in terms of educating managers within an organisation on, what resources might you use or point to if you're talking to others outside of your own organisation or within your organisation? What do you show them? And we've talked, a few people have mentioned a few books or Social Mobility Commission's resources. Is there anything in particular that you could point people to? So I'll start with you, James.
Well, I think the Social Mobility Commission Toolkit is a fantastic place to start. I mean, it very simply and thoroughly lays out an entire process that you can take on. You've done a hell of a lot of the work for everybody. So I'd really point towards that. And then I would just say, the thing, as I said before, that we always find is incredibly powerful is to get people with lived experience in front of management teams, giving them unvarnished truth. good and bad, about what the experience is like. That is a greater eye opener than anything I can say will ever be.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously done in that sensitive way as well. There's a great piece. There's some great people out there, I think, in terms of enable organizations to do people storytelling. And so, there's lots of organizations that can help you do that. Tim, from you, what do you think? What would you advise people to have a look at?
You touched on it earlier, Paula, in some of your remarks, that there's a great tendency to share stories of what worked, but also stories of what didn't work. And so that there are a number of organizations in various different sectors that bring together social mobility initiatives. Prime is the obvious one for law firms, probably, but there are many others. One thing that I've been very pleasantly surprised by since spending time dealing with formal diversity initiatives is that people really are willing to share. There is no jealous guarding of intellectual property and what works well, which in a way is surprising, because we're all of us hunting in the same pool for talented candidates. And so the assumption might be that if you've got something that works really well and it's getting you a terrifically talented and diverse group, you may not be prepared to share it with everybody else. And all I would say is that has not been my experience at all. People are willing to bare their souls about, look, we tried this because we thought it would work and it turned out to be a disaster, so don't go anywhere near it. But being able to participate in some of the representative groups and hear the stories and the learnings from others, I think is very valuable, not least because not everybody is at the same place in their journey, and inclusivity mustn't appear to be exclusive. If you've got people who've been doing it for years and they've honed their recruitment techniques and they've honed their promotion criteria, you don't want to switch off people who have come late to the party, but for all of the right reasons, because as James said, they recognize that there's an economic benefit in having the best talent with your organization, but that is also morally and socially the right thing to do. You don't want those people to be switched off by thinking that they're too late and there's nothing that they can learn from these people who've all been doing it for years and years. And so organizations like Prime are very good about finding the right sort of advice for where you are on your journey. And it's not always for the groundbreaking, challenging perceived norms. It can be about, this is how you start. This is how you might start doing a data collection exercise so that you can properly benchmark. Here are some of the providers of recruitment techniques that you might use. So I think get involved in organizations, because you will learn from your peers. That would be the resource that I would recommend people approach.
Definitely. And I think you're right in terms of, we've had a lot of employers who've shared their story and they recognise they're not that far ahead, but they want to share, the learnings they've had so far. So I'm just going to thank you both for your time. I've got a few housekeeping tips to share with everybody, but partly we'll obviously nod to the plug that both of you have given for the social mobility, and I've obviously given for the social mobility resources. So if I could ask everybody to complete our feedback survey. One of the things that we've included in this feedback survey is what topics you'd like to see. So there were loads of questions in the chat that weren't necessarily covering this topic. So do feel free to do our feedback survey and tell us what types of things you want to see in our success stories that we share from other employers, our blogs and our events. We've also got a resource called Let's Talk About Class, which you can find on the socialmobilityworks.org website. Our next masterclass is coming up on the end of May, and that is on apprenticeship. So please do register for that when you have got that. Colleagues and friends at the Social Mobility Employer Index. That is open for anyone who's on this journey and wants to enter into that index. I think applications close in a month from today, so start thinking about your applications. And then also friends that we've got at Making the Leap are soon to announce a Social Mobility Awareness Day on the 16th of June. We will be able to share, they've given us some resources, but they'll be on their website. Check out their website. They'll be putting some resources up within the next week or so. So please do kind of get involved. Advocacy internally and externally, talking about class within the workplace really helps drive this conversation. So it just remains for me to say thank everyone for joining, but especially Tim and James, who have shared their experience, and we look forward to seeing you on a future event.